And as we have seen, the extreme weather events in many parts of the world, both developed world and developing countries, climate doesn't distinguish. The extreme weather events only heighten the cause for urgent climate action. So it's clear that at some point, global emissions of greenhouse gases will come to zero uh, in the next 3 or 4 decades. What are the options for India? We have a developmental challenge. We have a huge developmental agenda which is unfinished. What do we do? Do we commit to a net zero pathway, or do we say, well, we'll wait and have our emissions rise with fossil fuels and then decline? There has been a furious debate in the media on this issue by leading scholars, and people have commented on various aspects of it. We in Shakti decided to commence a series of webinars to bring together scholars, stakeholders to debate various aspects of it. And this is a sequel in that series. We had 4 such webinars earlier, and today's one focuses on cities. What we have been talking about so far is what are India's technology options, policy options, societal, social issues for long-term decarbonization, potentially reaching zero emissions at some point in this century. What we're clear about is that if the world as a whole has to reach zero, at some point in this century, India too will have to reach zero. Whether that point is in 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades, that should come from modeling, analysis, and good sophisticated analyses. But what is clear is at some point we will be reaching zero emissions. Now, in coming to today's webinar, why cities? And it's just a coincidence. Yesterday, IEA released a report on cities' role in climate action. And the numbers are quite clear. At the global level, 50% population lives in cities. Cities account for world's 75% energy, and cities account for close to 70% of global CO2 emissions. So it's quite clear that from that lens, if you look at these numbers, the action lies in cities. And if we can tackle cities, largely we would be have made a significant progress in achieving the climate solution as far as cities goes. But however, it's not that simple because and there are various factors. For example, these numbers would suggest that a lot of emissions do come from cities. A lot of energy is consumed in cities. However, the sources for these may be outside cities. For example, a lot of electricity is consumed in cities, but the supply of electricity is from outside cities' jurisdiction limits. The scope for rooftops photovoltaics has been limited so far, and most of it does come from outside. Likewise, if we talk about electric vehicle e-mobility plans, while cities help in providing charging infrastructure and deployment of EVs, but the actual manufacturing issues in EV, they are beyond cities' limits. So first question is, what are the issues that are within cities' jurisdiction limits? What are beyond cities' limits? Second is the decision-making process of what lies with states and what lies with cities. And this varies from city to city, state to state. It's a very dynamic thing depending upon the political culture of the state and the city in question. And finally, what is the role of various stakeholders in government, industry, the civil society, citizenry in decision making and making these changes happen? So that's a brief background or context for today's webinar, friends. We are delighted that today we have a very distinguished panel who will deliberate on this. We have split this webinar into 2 parts. The first part will have a dialogue between Shri Aaditya Thackeray, Honorable Minister for Tourism, Environment and Protocol, Government of Maharashtra, with Shakti's Chairman, Mr. Jamshyd Godrej. On behalf of all colleagues in Shakti and on behalf of our chairman, I welcome Shri Aaditya Thackeray. Welcome to you, sir, for this webinar, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
In the second part, we have distinguished panelists from various spheres who will discuss the issue in some more detail. We have Dr. Rajiv Gowda, a leading academician and a former member of Rajya Sabha and an active thinker in this space. We have Mr. Ashish Rao Ghorpade, who is a leading scholar with ICLEI. And we have Pooja Tiwari, who is from Bloomberg Philanthropies, who represents philanthropic space. We also had invited Manisha Mahiskar, and Principal Secretary Environment, Government of Maharashtra. She had agreed to come, but she had to back out at the last moment because of some emergent family circumstances. So with this, I will stop. I will request our chairman, Mr. Jamshyd Godrej, to lead the discussion with Honorable Minister. The invite suggested a fireside chat. The COVID and all prevents us lighting a fire. So we can assume there is a virtual fire and we can talk around it. So over to you, Mr. Godrej.
Yeah, welcome to this webinar. I really appreciate the fact that you have shown a high level of dynamism in the state of Maharashtra and specifically for the city of Mumbai. And I wanted to just explore with you what are the things that have really motivated you and sort of been instrumental in your passion and interest in this area. I have had a long time been chairman of the Worldwide Fund for Nature in India. And I've spent a lot of time with my colleagues in WWF India and globally, concerned and working on these issues of conservation. As you know, the threats to the planet and to our country, our cities, our states is enormous. It's not just the recent weather events that have taken place, but when you see a whole series of events taking place around the world, you realize that what the scientists have been saying, that with climate change, we should expect more extremes, which means, much more heat in the summer, much colder winters, a lot of rain in the rainy seasons, and a lot of drought in the drought season. And these extremes, are going to be more and more exaggerated as the sort of tipping points are reached in different parts of the world. Science tells us that we need to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in the average temperature of the globe before the end of this century. But we are already experiencing effects of 1.5 degree exceeding 1.5 degrees. So I thought I would just sort of ask you, how did your interest develop in this area? And how do you approach this whole subject of climate change? Your portfolio, of course, also includes tourism. And we know that, tourists always want idyllic locations to have a wonderful holiday in. And if their holiday is disturbed for any reason, it could be COVID, it could be climate change, etc., then they are not happy either. So, of course, tourism is a huge economic driver for any, wherever, any country, any city, any place. It has a huge value addition. So, I mean, when you put all this together, how do you see, your portfolio and responsibility as comes to Maharashtra and specifically to Mumbai, since we're talking of cities today?
So thank you for getting me on this, because it's an honor to be interacting with you. Been seeing, the work that you've been doing for wildlife, for environment. It's for people like us, it's quite inspirational, to be very honest. For me, how I came into this, or how I became passionate about environment and climate change, I think there are two factors to it. Largely my family, be it my grandfather, my father who's a wildlife photographer at heart, and of course my brother. So my brother is quite the one who's always in the forest. He's behind new species, discovering them. He's discovered and published on 33 new species, right from snakes to snails and different things. But I'm not someone who could be deep diving so much into wildlife as he does, but he's into conservation. He's into flora fauna conservation. So that is one of his aspects, and I've always had this little interaction with nature out there. But where my concern for the environment really comes in is as much as we start tackling daily issues for governance, for administration, for city planning each day, you realize that the biggest issue today and the biggest hurdle is climate change. Anything that you want to really plan, any new road, any new development issue, climate change has always been a factor. And I was just saying this before I got into this video call, that it's quite a coincidence that today when we're speaking about climate change in cities, we're facing one of the worst natural calamities that we faced in recent times, where 6 or 7 of our districts are quite honestly underwater because of a deluge. And rainfall that no one could really measure, because Mahabaleshwar has got almost 600 of rain. We started counting in inches. But the fear really that I draw is a couple of years ago, I think the year was about 2004 or 5, we had watched a movie in school called The Day After Tomorrow. And, I keep repeating this story because it's so true. And that's where the fear stuck in my mind really deep. The climate change issues that they've shown in Day After Tomorrow, most of it about flooding and the global precipitation measures changing. We thought back then, okay, this is not something which is really relevant to us. It's probably something that's going to be for the next generation, or for generations down the line, not so immediately. It would be probably 100 years down the line. But today what we see is exactly the same things happening around the world. If you see the global issues that we are facing, the bushfires in Australia, the negative 60 degrees in Seattle, and then plus 50 degrees in Canada. Then you've got Germany, you've got China underwater, you've got London underwater in some parts, and regularly that we see in Mumbai. Even in terms of Mumbai, when we look at be it cities like Bengaluru, Chennai, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Surat, Delhi, NCR, and when we look at waterlogging, whenever we have rainfall, obviously there's a lot of opinions that come in. There's a lot of tweets that happen, some of them politically motivated, some of them just generally, frustrated about the city life. And we do speak about the crumbling infrastructure of cities. And what we've got to realize that it's no longer about urban flooding anymore. It's no longer about the crumbling infrastructure anymore, because most of these cities are equipped with the maximum technology you can have to deal with something like waterlogging. This is about climate change, because on a day-to-day basis, we've been seeing rainfall that's more than about 200 in a span of 4 hours or 5 hours, and no city in the world can really hold it. And like Dr. Bhardwaj was also saying, I think what is very crucial in terms of climate change and mitigation and adaptation, it is the cities that should, would, and could lead the way forward, because we are probably the biggest problem for climate change, and we are probably the biggest solution for climate change, because the impact, the footprint that we can have on climate change mitigation and adaptation is tremendous. I think for us, what was sort of a misguided effort till now, personally, in my opinion, is whenever we've spoken about afforestation or rainwater harvesting or percolation or anything to do with nature, we go out to the forest, which is already thick of forest cover, and we start planting trees or seeds and stuff like that. But what we don't realize is, in compensation to that, we're actually destroying the natural environment and surroundings that we are living in our own city. And what we are destroying it with, be it concrete, be it steel or whatever, is found on our own planet. So I think the bottom line to that is, if we do everything in a balance of what the other word for it would be, sustainable development, then we can live and coexist with nature. Because normally what we say is, let's save the planet, let's save our nature. But we forget that we are part of the same planet or nature. We are a part of it. We are not separate, or we're not from a different planet. We're not destroying the planet with elements from a different planet altogether. It's what we do with our own hands is coming from the same planet that we're living on and utilizing things from. So I think cities would and could, like I said, definitely play a big role. And that's where I am pushing the agenda for climate change mitigation and action.
Yeah, thank you. That was really useful, and great description of your interest in this area and your responsibility in the government. And, cities, as Anshu also mentioned earlier, I mean, they are the engine of growth. I mean, without cities, we will not see our economies thrive the way that they are around the world. And as you rightly pointed out, they are both, part of the problem as well as part of the solution. As far as cities are concerned, one of the crucial aspects has been administration in cities. I think we have seen different models of governance in different parts of the world. In India, we don't have the same type of governance that, say, in many other major cities. If you take London or New York or San Francisco, any of these big cities, they have their own local government with empowered mayors and an organization. We don't have that. And that's not going to change overnight. So within our system, how do you see, the ability for cities to sort of grow whilst, we obviously can't ignore the importance of the hinterland and the agriculture and people living in slightly extended areas around cities. But how would you see the development of cities taking place? Broadly speaking, do you think that the ideas, for instance, there is an architect in Paris who has been talking about some concept called the 15-minute city, which means that anybody, wherever you live, within 15 minutes, you can, your place of work, your place of entertainment, your shopping, whatever is always available. You can walk to it, you can cycle to it. These are the sort of concepts which are being talked about. What is your thinking about the development of our cities, and specifically of Mumbai? Of course, Maharashtra has other big cities also, Pune and Nagpur and Nasik and etc.
So for sure, in terms of cities and urbanization, I think that's a big question that we speak about. And normally, again, in the last decade, the word urbanization has got its glamour and the blots that it carries along. I think what we could really do in the sense of, being talking about a city or this urbanization having an urban sprawl across the state or the country, because largely about 50% of the population is urbanized today. We need to redefine what cities mean. We need to redefine what urbanization means. If urbanization only means concrete jungles, I think we've got something wrong there, because most of the people, in terms of whoever's evolved or moved up the ladder in terms of the socioeconomic strata, comes from a small town, a hometown, or a village to an urban center like a Mumbai, Pune, Nasik, Nagpur, Thane, looking for a job. And as he escalates one by one, he starts living near his workspace, which is probably the central banking district or the main corporate district. Then he finds a bigger space, he moves a little away from that. Then he finds a bigger home, he moves into the suburbs. And when he's accumulated a good amount of money, he goes back to the country life, which is actually the village he could have probably come from. So what we don't realize is we need a balance of both. We've started looking in terms of, if you see Pune or even Nagpur, you have a lot of buildings and housing societies, a lot of small bungalows who've got rooftop farms, rooftop gardens, gardens in their own compound. So what we need to realize is, be it urban, be it rural, we need to define what it is, because the good of both urban and rural needs to be balanced in both ways, even in cities and in villages. Because when we speak of urbanization, it cannot just be rampant cutting of trees or filling up of lakes, to create something of a different kind. What we need to do in terms of urbanization is figure out the mold it fits into. If urbanization would mean rainwater harvesting and percolation and better stormwater drainage, better sewage treatment plants, I think that urbanization is really helpful for us to take spread into the country. If we mean better solid waste management, if we mean better vehicle access or public transport access, that urbanization could be really helpful for most of our villages. If we mean the use of technology in climate resilient agriculture, if we mean better electricity supply to the farms, if we mean solar pumps, if we mean drip irrigation as a part of technology that's moving from the urban sector to the rural sector, I think that urbanization is really, really helpful. So I think these efforts we need to push out. In terms of cities being 15-minute city, most of our cities, especially across India, having come to life after the age of the motor car, they're not planned to be 15-minute cities. Cities like London or Paris are radial cities. Most of New York is, again, a motorable city. So you wouldn't probably find something in 15 minutes distance. But I think the concept we could adopt is 15 minutes through a public transport system. So you could get onto a metro, public transport bus, a cab, which is green, and get to your place in 15 minutes. So I think these are some of the concepts that we need to redefine for a world that is rapidly developing, and attach the word sustainable to almost everything. So even if we're talking of a rural life or an urban spread, urban sprawl, a suburban area, I think the benefits of urbanization, better healthcare, better education, better lifestyle, those, if carried as the benefits of urbanization to the rural villages, could help us balance jobs, could help us balance migration, could help us balance migration due to jobs or climate crisis. I think that is a major benefit that we could take to the villages.
Yeah. You're absolutely correct in your diagnosis and some of your ideas that you've been talking about. I think the earlier concept was always that there is one big downtown area where everybody goes to work, and there is, then somebody lives far away from it. So you have to continuously travel up and down. We have seen that in Mumbai. Of course, Mumbai geographically is a north-south city. But but I mean, when we think about how development can take place, the concept of 15-minute city actually talks about multiple centers for cities. So you have many little mini cities within a city. That's the idea. And your idea of using the metro and other public transport to connect the city is absolutely correct. I mean, there has to be a limit to the number of cars that any city will be able to
Exactly.
have.
So when we talk of even a development plan, for example, Mumbai is a development plan 2034, Pune is making one, you've got other cities in India making one. But for us as metro cities, where we are already saturated with the development, we can't rezone it very easily. It's not going to be simple unless you have an urban renewal that's coming in place. For example, Dharavi, that would probably completely change the face of the city, or something like the Mumbai Devi area, where you can actually have an urban renewal. So these are centers where we could actually do walk to work and things like that. But, it's going to be city in cities.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is exactly the right concept, city within a city. And I think that there's no doubt that COVID, has brought about greater consciousness amongst people about the connection between healthcare and the climate change, development, etc. I mean, the people have realized that when everyone was forced to work from home, and it's only because of the marvel of modern technology and the internet and the ability, like today, talking to you from a distance, that we are able to actually continue with our lives, our businesses, etc. And but the danger that we see in many cities around the world is that if pandemics like the COVID, were to increase, if these types of viruses and infections, etc., were to increase, what is the resilience that cities would have, and how do we build that resilience in to protect ourselves from all sorts of health-related issues? I mean, today we talk of COVID, but we know in Mumbai, we've had all sorts of diseases over the years. And even today, for instance, tuberculosis is still a major problem in a city like Mumbai because of crowding. And in the past, we've had the plague, we've had all sorts of problems, but cities have to be resilient because they are the engines of growth. So we need to build that resilience. So your thoughts on how we build resilience?
I think it's probably one of the first times in 100 years that governments have actually started focusing a lot on healthcare. And we've also started realizing a lot more about the value of our own dear and near ones. We've started, calling and asking people how they're doing. We've started getting together. After being in isolation, we've started realizing the importance of just, responsible behavior towards nature, towards work, worshipping work, and in terms of the quality of life that is needed. People who could get to work from home have actually started doing that. People who could stagger their work hours have started doing that. A lot of people I know who have also started working from, like I said, the suburban areas or city spaces outside Mumbai, be it, the near rural areas, be it isolated homestays. But nonetheless, we have to look at one of the stats, which is very, very crucial for our own country. the western coast of India, largely, if you see the plague, if you see the Spanish flu, if you see the current pandemic of COVID-19, we have been hit much more on the western coast for some reason than the other parts of India. So be it Maharashtra, be it Gujarat, be it the northern quarter of the left side, I think that is more vulnerable. We need to see what it is really. We need to figure out if it is a climatic thing, if it is, how it sustains more. But apart from that, I think what we really need to do, apart from resilience, is one of the biggest issues that we need to address today is housing. Housing, education, and health. These three issues really matter the most to us and, to all of us. Fortunately for us in India, education and healthcare, though largely affordable, has to be more accessible to the people. Education can bring about a lot of change in our society, in our civic behavior, in our responsibility, in our everyday living, and of course, upping the quality of life. While on the other side, of course, healthcare is something that we really need to focus on. Today, when we've had a pandemic, of course, all of us as corporates, as governments, as private sector, public sector, we've not seen the difference between each other. We've, right from vaccination to testing people to isolating people or creating jumbo COVID centers, we've all come together as one human race to, fight against COVID because it's a matter of survival. Likewise, I think we need to realize that climate change, zoonotic diseases, all of that is going to be a matter of survival. And I've often said this before, that we don't need incentives for survival. That's our basic instinct. And if we have to do that as the human race, when we speak, the developed world or westernization, but what we need to really pull through those, from cities or states like Singapore or any other country in the world where you have better healthcare, is how do you make good healthcare accessible to the common man, as is in a time like pandemic today? How do you make quality education? How do you bring quality and equality in education? I think that is really crucial. I think these two factors, if we can really look into, most of it would be, streamlined. And third, of course, in a city like Mumbai, one of the biggest issues is housing, where you have a lot of informal housing, and that affects the quality of life, that affects healthcare, that also affects climate change. That is something we're really deep diving into currently, because that's one wound that's opened up big time.
Yeah. When President Biden became president in the US, he said that climate change will be all of government action. Yes. So it doesn't matter, which part of government you're in, but whichever part of government you're in, climate change will have to be part of your planning process. Do you think that's a good idea? And how do you think we could do something?
That is not just a good idea, that's really important and imperative right now. It's about time that we do this. And I just regret the fact that this climate change talk has started in 2020s. It could have started in 1980s, 1970s at the level that we are talking today. Because back then, we at least had an option to turn back from the highway that we've set onto. Today, if you ask me, looking at the world, looking at the reports that we are facing every single day in terms of precipitation, in terms of hailstorms, in terms of every calamity that we're facing, just last year, Maharashtra's dispensed almost 13,500 crores in terms of compensation due to calamities arising from climate change. Likewise, the whole country has done its bit in terms of compensation. But when we say that we have 1 decade remaining for climate change action, I think that's too long a time we're giving to ourselves. It's not so much time that we have in our hands. Looking at, if you just take a world map or just Google climate change issues around the world, you have, Siberia burning, you've got Oregon burning, you've got bushfires in Australia, you've got floods around the world. It is a scary scenario. And to think that we have the luxury of another 10 years for climate change action, I think we're fooling ourselves. We have to act unitedly. We have to be faster than what we are today. We've got to realize that this is not about incentives. This is about what you need for survival. And if we've got to survive the next decade, we need to adapt whatever we can, because I think, again, we've gone past the time that we could stop climate change. It's not in our hands anymore. And nature is such a thing that, it's like dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were wiped out, probably the human race. And I'm not predicting a doomsday scenario, but the fear is real. Look at the amount of lives a zoonotic disease like COVID has taken. Look at the amount of lives threatened by floods. Look at the amount of lives threatened by droughts. This is big, and this is something that we've never seen before. We need to act swiftly. And I believe I was reading somewhere about Montreal. It's got a climate test for every of its city decision that the city council passes. So likewise, in fact, I have been pondering on an idea which I would probably write to the Honorable Prime Minister, to have a National Council for Climate Change. And most of the important decisions that are taken in the country, of course, there will be some hurdles when we're talking of development. But I think if we can have reasonable sustainability added to it, we could really figure out a way ahead, because finally it's about finding the balance.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, we have to have a balance between development and action for climate change. There's no doubt. And each one depends on the other, and each one threatens the other. So clearly there's a good need for that.
And if we have responsible development, we can really, mitigate climate change, because development would mean better proper homes. So your dependency on cutting something like a forest wood in for cooking meals, that would reduce. If you have better homes with your own sewage treatment plants in the complexes, your amount of disposal into the seawater, which is untreated, would be much lesser. So development is actually needed for climate change mitigation, but we need to have it sustainable.
Yeah. The Confederation of Indian Industry, about 15 years ago, we started this drive in India to build green buildings. These are essentially rated buildings. Today, not just rated buildings, but we would like each building to be a net zero building. And it's possible even to retrofit older buildings and make them green buildings, and even make them net zero buildings. I would think that for Maharashtra, this would be really important, because we have a lot of buildings to build, whether it's for housing or for other purposes. And we need to move and thrust on green buildings. India today has the second largest stock of rated green buildings in the world. And this is because of the Green Building Center in Hyderabad that CII started and moved throughout the country. And we'd like, Maharashtra, for instance, and especially Mumbai, to make it almost, I can't say mandatory, but close to mandatory for every building, new building to be a green building, and, give incentives for older buildings to become green buildings. What do you think of that idea?
So we're working on a couple of fronts on that, and I would love to actually interact with the CII and get the report so that we can make it mandatory, because it's time that we work on that, because even in the environment department, where we give permissions for new complexes and housing complexes and industries, we've actually started enforcing stricter climate change and adaptation measures for the same, be it rainwater percolation pits, rainwater harvesting, sewage treatment plants, green belts. We're also exploring a way to work with the MIDC to implement the green belts that are shown on paper always. We're trying to get them to do that, because a lot of CSR can be used by factories in that. We're also upping the quality of life for the factory workers there, for the management there. So that is one of the things. Apart from that, like you rightfully said, working on two things. One is, of course, the newer buildings and the new housing societies or office complexes that come up. And we probably could also have, a convention or a conference with architects, urban planners, to make it more green, and how can we actually define what green buildings are? Because a thing like a glass building, now that's a Scandinavian concept for absorbing more heat, whether it is possible or feasible or really wanted in a country like India, where we already face a lot of heat. I think that is one of the challenges. But going beyond that, in terms of retrofitting, last year on Gandhi Jayanti, we started a movement called Maji Vasundhara. And normally as governments, we tend to preach to the world about climate change, and we tell them, use public transport, your buildings should be retrofitted, do this, do that. I said, let's start with ourselves, because the government's footprint is the largest in all cases. So we started working on all the 5 elements, and through whatever our officers were fighting as the second wave of COVID, in terms of divisional commissioners, collectors, municipal commissioners, we've actually started working on planting more trees in urban forests within the city, and more in our own headquarters of the municipal corporation or the government or the collectorate, starting to do that. We're starting to retrofit our own offices for rooftop solar, sensor-based lighting in corridors and toilets that are not often used, converting to LED lights, having rainwater harvesting and percolation pits. So we started that movement, but yes, we need to give it more of a push to actually retrofit the amount of older buildings. And of course, the new ones will have all these facilities, because what is a good thing is a lot of young women and men, a lot of new home buyers are actually more aware about climate change, and they're also wanting these facilities in their own buildings. So that is a major sector we could really work on.
Yeah. In fact, when we started the movement for green buildings, the first green building we built in Hyderabad cost almost 40% more than a normal building, because none of the materials that we needed for making a green building were available at that time. Today, actually, there is no cost increase. It is more, it's more the mindset that, yes, I will have a green building. And, even if it's 1 or 2% more, that's fine. But you have to start with the proposition that every building must be a green building. And I think that if we can move in that direction, that would make a huge difference to what, as you know, there's a concept of urban heat island,
Yes.
Because cities are so concentrated and there's so much energy used in cities, that it does become a somewhat heat island. Temperatures are slightly more than in the surrounding areas. And green buildings can make a huge difference to that. So I think I would encourage you to move as rapidly as possible on green buildings, both new as well as existing buildings to be retrofitted.
We're doing green buildings, and along with that, we're also looking at other infrastructure to be more green. So in cities like Mumbai, Pune and all, we're trying to have urban thickets, even in traffic islands that are big enough to have at least 50, 60 trees. But Mumbai, Pune and Mumbai, Nagpur highway, and now the Mumbai, Bengaluru highway, what we're looking at is actually greener highways. So we're solarizing our highways. For the last 2-3 years, I was chasing that. Today, we've come to a point where we can have 3 solar parks on the Mumbai-Nagpur highway, generate almost 250 megawatts of electricity, solar energy through this highway, we're looking at planting almost 100,000 trees alongside the highways, and these will be avenue trees and in different layers. So you obviously have indigenous trees, you have fruit flower trees, but you also have that whole green belt, because normally on a highway with a lot of concrete, you tend to feel much more heat than, in a street like in Mumbai or any other city. So I think that is also something we're looking at. And like I said, it's climate emergency right now.
Yeah. So you mentioned this program of yours, which you started called Maaji Vasundhara Abhiyan. Could you tell us more about it and what you hope to achieve?
So we were looking at basically, like I said, to start off with, and last year was UN's Year of Nature. And in terms of nature, what do you really do with nature? So we looked at the 5 elements of nature. And we said, if we are to contribute anything to a global movement about nature as the Environment and Climate Change Department, we need to start from ourselves, look inwards and see how the government can really transform itself, adapt itself to protecting nature through the 5 elements. Now, for us, of course, we were battling with the second wave of COVID, but overall, we've planted almost 21.5 lakh trees across Maharashtra in terms of the urban centers, and then rural separate, of course. Through rainwater percolation and harvesting pits, we've saved almost as much water as Maharashtra consumes in a day. And we're looking at much more in that sense. So all 5 elements of nature, be it in terms of energy, we're looking at rooftop solar, we're looking at LED lights. So this is a movement that was started only for the government offices to start off with. But as a result of which, and the popularity that gained over a period of time, you had a lot of local groups, NGOs, local politicians, MLAs and MPs being a part of this, because we had cash prizes for the districts that really do well for schemes that they plan for the next year. So it's almost like a Swachh Bharat thing, but on 5 elements of nature, ranging from better solid waste management to disposal of wastewater, to cleaning of your villages or your cities, to better energy works, and also self-auditing in terms of energy usage, self-auditing in terms of transport. So if the municipal commissioner or if a divisional commissioner or a collector lives close to his office, can he walk it down for a day or 2? Can he go by a bicycle? Can he use carpool? So all of these things put together, that really generated a lot of interest. And now we're looking at a lot more people, be it corporates, be it diplomats, be it schools, colleges, giving them toolkits, a certain amount of deeds that they can really work on and engage with us.
Yeah, very, very innovative ideas. I think this is a great concept, and I hope that we can do whatever we can from Shakti's point of view to help you. Just to mention about Shakti, we work with over 100 partners in India on various aspects, on energy, on transport, on climate resilience, etc. Recently, the government of Bihar has approached Shakti to work with them on developing their climate action plan for the whole state. And we've started that work. And, I think these are ideas that if states come together on these type of ideas, I think there's a lot of learning. Maharashtra is actually quite well ahead of Bihar, say, for instance. Say if you have a partnership, between states, that this concept of twin cities around the world, but twin states in India could be another idea, that 2-3 states come together, work on climate action plans, learn from each other, see what works. Do you think that would be something that we could discuss about?
I think that is very, very crucial because finally, like I said, when we speak about the environment department, till now, we've always been a regulatory department. We've always been something that is, giving permissions and putting notices on industry saying, okay, you're releasing wastewater or not. But when we look at the global scenario and the importance of climate change for a country like India, 1.3 billion people leading the way, and a country where our basic ethos of worship is nature worship. Most of our religions stem from nature worship. Agni, Vayu, Bhumi, Jal, Akash. I think this is the place which could really lead the movement. And most of our worship, like I said, we worship the sun god, we worship fire, we worship a river, we worship the seas. When we made idols out of it and brought them into our own homes, that's when we started polluting what we worshipped. So I think it's about time that we can lead the way for the world. And where we have something like a GST council, where we have, a couple of portfolios in India, which is be it home, be it finance, which are really important. I think environment day by day is getting more important. So we need a partnership of states, because for a country like ours, where we have mines, where we have, different forests, where we have tiger corridors, where we have elephant corridors, we need to build stronger partnerships and realize that what is going to be polluting as, as the unit somewhere is going to affect 5 other states around us. And we are all interdependent. So it is a concept that, it's about time that we start linking ourselves with other states. For us as, Maharashtra, we've also tied up C40. We're also a part of WRI. We're trying to be a part of all these global networks, because again, we believe that in today's world where COVID saw no latitude, no longitude, no altitude, no temperature change, I think these are issues that are global. And for us, it's not about just exchanging views. It's also about learning from each other, where our experiences could really help each other. So we need to come together now.
Yeah, that I really appreciate that. At the end of this year, in November, we're going to have the COP26 in the UK. And one of the ideas that has been floated at COP is this race to zero for cities.
Yes.
And Mumbai, I think, has already joined or will be joining.
We're getting 5 more cities from Maharashtra to join in.
Yes. So, I think this, it's not a competition in the sense that, who's ahead and who's behind. It's more about cooperation. Yes. And, just what we were talking a moment ago about states. Cities also can learn a lot. You mentioned C40 cities, etc. So I would only encourage you to, join this movement and commit these 5 cities in Maharashtra to this race to zero. And I think there are a lot of expertise, knowledge, practice that has been available today. Just as an example, the World Resource Institute, you mentioned WRI, has something known as the Ross Prize for Cities. The latest, the second Ross Prize for Cities was just given a few days ago. And it was given to a city in South America where the residents came together to build their own cooperative food system. So basically, it was urban farms, that people would grow agricultural produce and then in a cooperative way, having regional sort of markets in the city. And this city in South America won the Ross Prize for Global Cities Development because it involved people, it involved local government, it involved economic growth, and it involved survival issues such as food, for instance. So this was a wonderful idea of people sort of really making a difference for their own city. So how do you see this concept of people being much more involved, civil society, organizations, and others being much more involved in this movement along with you?
I think that is finally the base, because you're finally doing it for the survival of people and all of us together. It's going to be a two-way responsibility. We're developing a state climate action plan. We also, like I said, we're getting 5 more cities into the race for zero, and maybe it could be a really good race, because so normally when we have industries coming to our country or to our state, the states are pitching and trying to have a competition against each other, saying, how much are we giving to the industry to come into our state? Likewise, if we can actually reach the race to zero faster, because we're working with a couple of cities like Pune now, trying to get them carbon neutral by 2030. We're also probably one of the first states that would now put out an expression of interest for an agency to work with us for actually calculating the carbon footprint of a couple of our industrialized and non-industrialized towns and suggest ways to make them carbon neutral. But like you said, it's going to be a two-way thing. And what gives me hope is the spirit of what we call Mumbai. It's always touted to be, it's always seen in a positive and negative light, but what really is the spirit of Mumbai? And what gives me hope is in the year 2016, 2017, we had a daily collection of waste, which was almost 10,000 metric tons a day. And back then, I remember the municipal commissioner, Mr. Ajoy Mehta, the mayor, all of us just sat together and we were like, what do we do with the amount of waste? Because it's going to a landfills, we're looking at waste to energy, but we need our area locality management teams. We need to have our NGOs, our cooperative housing societies working together. We devised a strategy where we said, if you don't segregate your waste, if you're a bulk generator, more than 100 kgs, and if you don't segregate your waste, we're not going to pick up your waste. We're not going to take it to the landfill, you deal with it. Within a span of 6 months, we've come down from 10,000 metric tons a day to 6,500 metric tons a day. I think that's what gives me hope. And this was only about 40 to 45% of the housing societies actually getting involved in waste segregation. And you know how difficult it is to get people to segregate waste, wet waste, dry waste, hazardous waste, plastic waste, things like that. But I think the people who want to really move on it, the people who want to do it, will do it. And for us as a country, where if we can go to smaller units, local units, where you have cities divided into wards, you have gram panchayats, you have zilla parishads, you have also corporates who are organized, you have agencies like the police, you have the home guards, where that these 50,000 people, these 30,000 people, these 3,000 people can actually make a change. I think we can look at the organized sector to bring about a change. For example, in Mumbai suburbs, we have almost 22,500 societies. These people, even one person from this housing society actually starts working for a thing like rainwater percolation, a thing like, and I say rainwater percolation because a runoff area is much more, and that's what creates waterlogging actually. But rainwater percolation, be it rainwater harvesting, be it also segregation in their own 5 flats in the building. I think that is what could lead the change. So for sure, what you say is really very important, that it's always going to be a two-way street. We would always have the policies, but we need the people to be working with us.
Yeah. Actually, India has been very blessed that we have so many voluntary organizations, people who have really got involved in all walks of life, whether it's education, it's social development, etc. Maharashtra has a very rich history of that also. And I think that we all recognize, that individually there's very little that we can do, but collectively we can do a lot. And I would say that, finding ways for these voluntary organizations to sort of empower them a little more, give them that opportunity to be involved in development issues in the city, in different parts of the city. Some sort of a program there might be very useful, where the government people, the municipal people, and the voluntary organizations actually work together. I'm sure there are good examples of that in many places.
There's one really good example in the city of Sambhajinagar, Aurangabad, where for the river Kham, you've got a couple of local volunteers and the municipal commissioner and school children coming together. And over the last 1 year, throughout COVID, every weekend they've gone there and transformed that river and the riverbank really without a single penny from the official coffers. But I think that is something which is really inspirational. And, they've been doing some great work there. Individuals out there, some really passionate environmentalists doing work there. But what we're looking to create now are two things. One is, of course, a river summit for Maharashtra, because we have a lot of rivers, a lot of holy rivers that are considered holy, but we need to, of course, get them clean and rejuvenated. And that could start with volunteering work. And the other is, of course, a platform for every aspect, every walk of life. You might be a corporate, you might be a policeman, you could be a rickshaw driver, you could be an NGO. But if I want to do something good for my planet, if I want to do something good for my country in terms of the environment, I need to start off within a sphere of my 10 feet. And if I can do that and really create a platform for that, that would be really helpful. So
Yes.
it's that's what we're trying to create.
Yeah. No, actually, many commentators have mentioned this, that if you go into any home in India, no matter how poor the residents are, the inside of the home is always very clean, but the outside of the home is not always that clean. So it's about community action. So you're doing something for yourself, but you're not worried about what happens outside your little sphere and the community. So we need to build that community spirit. And, if this program of yours, Maji Abhiyan and all this sort of thing, can actually rejuvenate voluntary organizations to help the government to achieve its aims, I think that will, help in accelerating this to a very large extent.
That's the idea, because in terms of environment, we normally have movements. I think it's about time that we move from movements to about making it a habit. And only when it's a habit to segregate my waste, only when it's a habit to crush my bottle and throw it back, or, like we have a habit when we are entering someone's home, we take off our shoes and enter the home. So, it's the same thing. So if we can make it a habit to be more sustainable, I think that could really help us.
Yeah, yeah. So I really do appreciate, having this chat with you. There is no doubt at all that cities have to be at the forefront of economic development, of social change, of environmental leadership. And your leadership in doing that is really very heartening. And I think that all the voluntary organizations today who are working in India, whether, like Shakti, like WRI, WWF, all of them have been driven by this idea that they should work in partnership with government. And so I really do appreciate your thoughts on this, and hope that, we can take this forward and work together. Good planning always, gives a lot of benefits. I'm always reminded that when I used to travel to Japan years ago, it was always very painful, because they used to spend a lot of time on planning, and they would plan and plan and plan and plan, and you would get so frustrated about it, but at the end of the day, you realize that, they have thought through a lot of things, and that planning has really benefited them in many of the ways that they have progressed. So I think these are great ideas and thoughts, and I greatly appreciate having this chat with you, and hope that we can continue talking about these issues over time. So greatly appreciate your thoughts and your leadership, and look forward to greater climate action for our cities and our state in Maharashtra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It's been an honor to interact with you, and I look forward to many more interactions and working with you together for climate change mitigation and adaptation, because there's a lot we can do together. So looking forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you. So Anshu, would you come back on the line?
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating discussion, and I really nice to hear about the inspirational leadership in Maharashtra, the kind of work which you mentioned, really very exciting to hear. I thank the Honorable Minister for his time to join this webinar and discussing his vision with us. And we look forward to working with you. We'll be most happy to support you in any of your initiatives. I'll be in touch with I've been in touch with Manisha. I've been discussing with her, and we'll discuss some specifics. I also thank Mr. Jamshyd Godrej for leading this discussion with the minister, and in a freewheeling talk, coming up with lots of new ideas and thoughts. Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
So, friends, that brings us to the close of this first part of the webinar. And going forward, we have distinguished panelists who will delve a bit deeper into this issue and talk from their experience and perspectives. We thought that to take a deeper dive, we brought people from different walks of life. As I said, we had requested Manisha to join the discussion. She, the Principal Secretary, Environment and Climate, Government of Maharashtra, also happens to be a dear friend and batchmate of mine from the civil services. Unfortunately, she had to back out today evening because of an exigency, so she could not join. We realized the role of philanthropy because philanthropy has catalyzed climate action in various parts of the world, including India. In fact, Shakti has been supported by philanthropic capital for the last 10 years. And therefore, we requested Pooja to join us, Pooja Tiwari, who represents Bloomberg Philanthropies. Pooja, thank you for your time and agreeing to join with us, and we look forward to hearing you. We know the important role which policy think tanks play in climate action in providing high quality advice to decision makers. So many institutions like the ones which Mr. Godrej mentioned earlier, CEW and TERI, WWF, and a whole bunch of them, they have played enormous role in catalyzing climate action work, and ICLA is one of them. And we are delighted that Ashish Rao Ghorpade, who is the Deputy Director, has joined us today. Welcome, Ashish, and I thank you for your time. And finally, Professor Rajiv Gowda, I think your presence is incredibly important because at the end of a day, it is political will, it's political decision making, it's the what matters. We can generate any amount of knowledge, any amount of analysis, but it has to be realistic within the political, the Lakshman Rekha or the boundaries. So we would really count on your wisdom in and your insights in what is doable, what is not doable, what is realistic, what is pure academic, and things like that. So we requested Professor Rajiv Gowda, who has been an ex-member of Rajya Sabha and also professor at IIM Bangalore, to talk on these issues. So friends, I'll now hand over to my colleague Vivek Chandran, who coordinates our programs in transport and cities, to take the discussion forward from here onwards. Vivek, over to you.
Thank you, Anshu. I hope I'm audible. Thanks. And a very good evening to our esteemed panelists and to all the attendees who have joined us today. For the benefit of the audience, let me just go over the format for the panel discussion. So we have each of our speakers will have about 12 minutes to make their opening remarks, and I'll make sure to remind you when you have about a minute remaining. Once all the panels have presented, we will have 15 minutes to go over questions and answers. So I request all of the audience to please make sure to use the Q&A function on Zoom and raise the questions to the panelists. We will try to take as many questions as time permits. So without any further delay, let's welcome our first speaker, Ms. Pooja Tiwari, to share her thoughts on the role that philanthropy has to play and the importance of cities in climate action. Ms. Tiwari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivek, and hello and good evening to everyone. And I would say what an exciting fireside chat it was. Listening to Mr. Godrej and Honorable Minister Mr. Thackeray was really amazing. So those of you who don't know Bloomberg Philanthropies, it is a non-profit foundation set up by Mr. Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City. Excuse me. And currently he's serving as UN Special Envoy for Climate Ambition and Solutions. We support work in 810 cities across the world, and the focus areas, among others, include air quality, clean energy, and climate change. In India, we've partnered with the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change on providing technical support to the National Clean Air Program, working at the national, state, city level. And as part of this, we're supporting technical partnerships in cities including Patna, Bangalore, Surat, Delhi, and of course, Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation is a very critical partner in that. We also support the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, a network of 97 of the world's largest cities to share knowledge and collaborate on efforts to fight climate change by sharing best practices and strategies on programs like bus electrification, reporting climate actions in a standardized, measurable, consistent way, releasing coordinated research on the critical importance of city climate efforts. In fact, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Energy and Climate is another initiative co-chaired by Mr. Michael Bloomberg. At Bloomberg Philanthropies, we strongly believe that cities have a major role to play in addressing global challenges, and cities can be leaders and exemplars to drive change. The concentration of people and emissions means cities have the power to make a huge difference in fighting climate change. They are hubs of innovation and inspiration and are uniquely positioned to lead on climate and sustainability issues. And we really had a good taste of it when Mr. Godrej was speaking to Honorable Minister, Mr. Thackeray. We got a very good insight into the potential that cities have. In 2018, we had launched the American Cities Climate Change Challenge, which provides resources and supports to 25 US mayors as they accelerate climate action using a holistic approach that focuses on clean buildings and transportation. So each winning city received a unique package of support, including, say, additional staff capacity, technical assistance from world-class partners, access to intensive peer-to-peer networking, and support in launching communications, outreach, education campaigns. In total, actions from the American Cities Climate Challenge are projected to reduce emissions by about 40 million metric tons through 2025, the equivalent of taking 8.5 million cars off the road for 1 year. In terms of statistics, just to share a few, by now more than 20 interventions have been passed or implemented on buildings and transport. 170 megawatt new solar is under contract. About 34,000 energy audits have been completed. 858 new electric vehicles purchased and 213 miles of bike or pedestrian lanes added and improved. If we draw some insights based on our work across cities and sectors, I think we can identify 4 key ingredients that help drive progress: better evidence and data, policy leadership, people and public awareness, and finally, partnerships with governments, with think tanks, civil society, institutions, and of course, including citizens and community engagement. Sharing an example from New York, when he was mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg formulated Plan NYC, a plan for a greener, greater New York. And research found that one of the biggest sources of air pollution in New York was heating from buildings where boilers were burning dirty oil. So in order to address this, regulation and laws requiring a reduction of sulfur content and eventual phasing out of the dirtier heating oils were introduced. But to accompany these regulations and encourage a rapid switchover, the city administration, working with civil society, private sector partners, launched the New York City Clean Heat Initiative. So as a result of this, sulfur pollution reduced by nearly 70%, particulate pollution reduced by over 20%, leading to New York City having its cleanest air in 50 years. The NYC Clean Heat Initiative engaged with residents to communicate the benefits of switching to cleaner fuel, provided technical assistance for those looking to make that switch, and developed innovative financing mechanisms to be able to fund the change. Coming to some examples from the C40 cities, In July 2020, C40 mayors published an agenda for a green and just recovery, outlining bold steps to deliver an equitable and sustainable recovery. So C40 mayors' call to action includes that the only stimulus should be green, commit to protect mass transit, prioritize and invest in clean energy, invest in resilient cities as the engines of recovery, and end all public fossil fuel investments and subsidies. So as an example from Seoul, which is investing and incentivizing green jobs, the mayor of Seoul has put in place plans to tackle building emissions, which again was mentioned by Mr. Godrej, that account for 68% of citywide greenhouse gas emissions, beginning with a massive energy efficiency improvement to bring old, large municipal buildings to the efficiency of zero emissions buildings, and at the same time tightening mandatory zero energy building standards on the new ones. So this policy measure is expected to actually create around 20,000 green jobs by 2022. Also to highlight the Solar City Seoul project, where by 2022, every public building and 1 million homes in the city are set to be powered by solar. And another concept that was already mentioned, and I think that's very relevant and interesting, is this 15-minute cities or a complete neighborhood concept that was again discussed in the Fireside chat. It's a great framework for recovery, whereby all city residents are able to meet most of their needs within a short walk. In fact, mayors of Milan, Paris, Portland have all committed to it. Portland, as part of its climate action plan, has a 2030 complete neighborhood goal. So in which 90% of residents can access all their basic daily needs by foot or by bike. The city of Medellin in Colombia, it faces, like many other cities, the threat of rising urban temperatures due to climate change. The city's response brings people together, planting vegetation to create a better environment. Its 30 green corridors project shades cyclists and pedestrians, schools built up area, cleans the air along busy roads. And what's very interesting actually is that the city's botanical gardens, they train people from disadvantaged backgrounds to become city gardeners and planting technicians. So temperatures have really fallen by 2 or 3 degrees Celsius in places due to this project, and with even more reductions expected in the future. So the program came from the need to connect people to nature, recovering spaces that were occupied by concrete. Another example is of London, where research pointed to transport as the biggest source of pollution. The mayor had in 2019 introduced a 24-hour ultra low emission zone, which requires older cars to pay a charge over and above the congestion charge. And within 10 months, this led to 49% fewer polluting vehicles driving into central London every day. Carbon dioxide emissions from road transport dropped 6%. NOx concentrations dropped 44%. According to estimates, it would save the UK's National Health Service and social care around $7 billion. This year in October, this ULEZ will be expanded to cover an area 18 times larger than what was there earlier. So while this intervention has developed a strong policy framework in the form of an extra charge, hoping to incentivize more people to use public transport, on the other hand, it has also been accompanied by considerable community engagement to build consensus for the need for this kind of a change and to publicize it. This engagement has been with a large range of audience, including residents, those owning cars, businesses, employee bodies, as well as through active engagement with the press, advertisements, social media. So in the public consultation process alone, over 1 million people were contacted. And another quick example is a C40 city example is Freetown in Sierra Leone in West Africa, which has developed a publicly accessible GHG inventory with additional data points for energy, waste, transport, which form the basis for the process of emission target setting and scenario building. Also, in developing the transformed Freetown plan, the city undertook a comprehensive needs assessment that included more than 300 community meetings involving more than 15,000 residents In response, the city established a consortium of partners, including NGOs, to develop and execute programs. One example of an effective cross-cutting action that came about as a result of this inclusive policy design process is the Waste Management Micro Enterprise Program. So this program simultaneously promotes improved economic livelihoods, sanitation, environmental resilience by working with migrant youth. So it strengthens and improves waste collection services to informal settlements. And since its launch, the city has extended its waste collection service from 8,000 households to 30,000. Finally, I would like to
share.
Have
a minute left. I just wanted to interrupt. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks,
Go ahead.
Yeah. Finally, I would share recent analysis and modeling results by the Coalition of Urban Transition, supported by many actors worldwide, which shows that India's cities by 2030 are expected to produce 75% of GDP, and low carbon measures in cities could support the equivalent of 3 million jobs by 2050 and achieve 89% reduction in GHG emissions. And we also know that some of the Indian cities also, like we heard, have examples that are worth sharing, that one can learn from, whether it's the waste management from Indore or the emission trading scheme of Surat or Kolkata upgrading its tram network, and the national program like the Climate Smart Cities Assessment Framework. These are all helping Indian cities become more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive, and offer entry points for urban transformation. So there's a lot to learn here, but the key line remains: cities are very critical. Over to you, Vivek. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tiwari. I think you make some very good points there, ranging from the ideas of mayors having a role to play in many of these cities, and a range of issues across cities, from New York, Paris, Seoul. Those were really great examples. I think what really stood out was also the aspect of jobs that you were talking about, that the transition here is also skill-based. It's also about people, and it's also about a lot of jobs that are going to be created. I think you're saying 3 million jobs by 2030. That's quite a large number. So thank you so much. We will go on to our next panelist. So let me welcome our second speaker for tonight, Mr. Ashish Rao Godrej, and to make his presentation. So the topic that he'll be speaking about is on learnings from working with Indian cities on climate action. Welcome, Ashish, and I believe you have a presentation, so you could please bring it.
Yes, thank you. So I think I'll pull it up. I'll try to pull it up as we get started. I am grateful to the previous speaker for making a very strong case about why we need to look at cities. And so I think I don't need to focus on that. As ICLEI, I should say, we've been working with cities. I hope you're able to see the slide now. We are working with cities in India since, I think, 2001. I represent ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. We are a network of cities globally.
Ashish, I'm seeing a white screen. If that is what everyone's seeing, otherwise we could just correct that.
Yeah, so I think there's some issue then. Let me try again. But so I think I'll continue talking, and maybe it'll be better if you're able to, at your end, use the slides. Is that possible?
Slides, so I'll request my team to.
Yes, thank you.
Great, I think I see it now. Yeah.
Yes, so as an association of cities, we've been working with cities in India since 2001. Campaign called Cities for Climate Protection. At that time, I think we used to work with around 6 to 10 cities on climate action. And over the years, around currently, I think we work with around 60 Indian cities focusing on climate action. And there are 5 pathways. You can move to the next slide, maybe. This is just a map of the number of cities that we work with. The next slide, please. So we work across these 5 pathways: low emission development, nature-based development, equitable and people-centered development, resilient development, and circular development. And this is how we try to work with cities in India. A point that was made earlier and is relevant is that each city is unique, and so it's not one size that can fit all. And so we need to understand what is the context, what's the reality of each city, and focus on that. When I say ground reality, I mean government terms, I mean leadership tenures, I mean available funds, I mean technology that's ready or not, the socioeconomic condition of the city, and the ambition that the city might have. So focusing on all of that, we try and work across an approach which begins with looking at the current status. What is the reality of today? Setting up some targets that we can work with that are real, that are achievable, and that are acceptable to the city stakeholders, and then work together with the city to try and achieve them with a sense of what are the funds available, what is the capacity available, what is the technology that is available, or whether we need to pull together all of these to be able to reach where we are agreeing to reach. So in terms of the process that we follow, what you see in the slide right now is the kind of steps that we work with while we work with cities. There's a process guidance for which we have number of approaches. What is mentioned here is the Clean Climate Cities approach. I will, as we move on, tell you a little bit more about the various approaches. An active approach that looks at mitigation as well as adaptation approaches is the Climate Resilient Cities methodology that I'll try and tell you a little bit more about. As an approach, when we try and understand the current status, we use various tools and methodologies. Some of them are listed here. The ACER and ICLI tool looks at adaptation measures, vulnerability assessment. The Heat Plus or ClearPath tool looks at developing emissions inventory across cities. And then there are guidance solutions that we can work with. Oftentimes, we also need to look at whether it's possible to implement the measure that a city decides to implement based on the existing resources. And so we have also, together with other partners, developed these programs that allow us to showcase good, interesting, bankable projects that could be funded for implementation on ground as we are trying to address challenges that cities are working with. If I could move on. Next slide, please. So this is the approach that we are working with currently. It looks at working with cities on climate action, but looking at what is the current status of emissions and also the level of vulnerability that various urban systems have due to climate. And then based on that kind of an assessment, develop a climate resilient cities action plan, which can be implemented, which can be taken further on the implementation path with the city. There's an example of a number of such plans that we have developed with number of cities. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So I'm taking an example of one city. We work with a number of cities. I mentioned 60 plus cities for which we do climate action planning and mapping. Just to illustrate how we do this is the pie that is shown is telling you about the kind of emissions that can be mapped across various sectors in the city. And the table alongside shows you how these various urban systems are fragile or vulnerable to climate if there were changes in the current conditions in the city in terms of climate. So increase in precipitation, increase in heat, how will the various urban systems be affected? Using this kind of an approach, we work with the community. First, I think we identify a list of projects that would be relevant for the city, which is a long list. And then we work with the community in the city, which means the leadership, so the commissioner, mayor, but also the engineering team to try and understand what would be relevant, implementable, realistic in their conditions, and also something that they would be interested in implementing. Once we've had a look at their views, we also take it to other stakeholders. That means citizens, that means selected active civil society in the city, and get a sense from them in terms of how we can go ahead and implement this. And so based on this kind of a feedback system, we are able to identify specific projects that might be relevant for the city that we are working with for execution, implementation in coming time. And if I may read out one example for you. So solid waste, we're looking at a number of compost plants, 18 of them, 7.5 megawatt waste to energy plant, scientific capping of existing landfill, notification by the municipal corporation on waste segregation, and measures such as this. Can we move to the next one, please? And so it's a long list of measures. It's a specific list of measures that we arrive to based on various consultations with the city, which then becomes an action plan for the city. Now, this action plan is a document that could be kept aside and be of no use to the city at all. So the effort we make in making sure that this is something of relevance to the city is to get it passed through the council and make it a document that is owned by the municipal corporation. Once that happens, we also try and see the measures that have been identified, if some of these measures could be included in the municipal budgets for implementation, making sure that existing resources that the city has, planned resources that the city plans to work with, are connected with these measures, and these can be implemented on ground. So that's the approach that we follow. And an example of a number of projects that a city, so Rajkot picked up as an example, I can show you the kind of projects that then get implemented in the city. These are quick win projects. These are smaller projects that have been implemented already in Rajkot thanks to support from SDC, a project called Capacities, that we are working with since last 4 years and continue to work for more cities. So focusing on renewable energy applications for social housing, installation of 60 kilowatt power solar PV system in a water filtering plant, installation of air quality measurement systems in the city, and groundwater recharge systems for as an adaptation measure in the city as well. These are projects that can be implemented with resources that are available at hand, planned through projects, or available to the city through their own budgets. But if we move on to in the next slide, we also try and identify longer term, bigger projects that might require additional resources not available to the city right now. And so there are the kind of projects that are listed here, some of them also having a 20-year planning horizon that would require large amount of resources to be thought of. But as we develop these projects together with the city, we are able to get a sense of what all will be required to execute these projects. And so we are able to take these ideas to fruition in coming time. These are the kind of efforts that are made. Some pictures to show work happened on ground that made some kind of a difference. And we take the work that gets implemented also to share across in the city through media, through interaction with community and cities. And what works very well, then we can take it higher for sharing with other cities. Next slide, please. So we have a number of platforms available where projects do not have the provision for sharing success examples. And so, for example, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network for South Asia, or the Asia-led partnership that we coordinate, we are able to take these good examples there, sometimes even examples that did not work, for us to be able to share it with others, or to have external success examples, peers sharing their learnings with cities. So in general, this is the approach that we have been following for implementing projects in cities. And I wanted to mention, I think Pooja mentioned about the climate smart cities assessment framework. I think the last assessment that was carried out, ICLEI was able to support I think a 30 plus number of cities in their participation, and most of the cities that we were able to work with. You could take the slides down, please. most of the
You
cities
have a
that
minute, Ashish.
yeah,
Sure.
most of the cities that we worked with could perform very well in their assessment. So that's really good to see, and that's really something that we take pride in, being able to work with the cities in India. In terms of learning specifically, as I end, I wanted to mention what we've seen is that we need to understand, as we work with the cities, the existing term that we have at hand with the elected council or the administrative officials, which means around a 3 to 5 year period that's available to work with cities. We need to definitely work with the entire municipal team and various key stakeholders that are existing in the city so that the measures that we implement are accepted, are rooted in the city. The efforts that we make, they need to be mainstream. So we develop action plans, we get council validation, we get them included in the budget, but we also need to make sure that the citizens know. And most important aspect is we also need to connect it to the plans and programs that the state and the national government is running to make sure that these do not stand aside from this mainstream. And overall, I think it is about working for local priorities. If we are able to do that, we will see change, we will see improvement, and we'll be able to get others to work with us on making further improvements. So I stop there, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ashish. Great presentation. Great insights into what the technical details and methodological steps are to go down the path of a climate action plan at cities. I think that's very useful for us all to kind of get a visual idea of what that looks like. You also talked about the feasibility challenges in cities and how to overcome them, finance being an absolutely important problem that most cities are dealing with. But also, I think it is important that you highlighted how you engage with the urban governance system itself, right? And how that approach works. So thank you very much for your presentation. Going with the theme of urban governance, I think we will go to our next speaker to throw more light on the issue, also from his deep understanding about the political economy around cities. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Mr. Rajiv Gowda, and over to you, sir, to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Vivek, and thank you to you and the Shakti Foundation team for putting together this really fascinating discussion. And you've given me the hardest part to, everyone else has been so full of idealism and, sort of action that brings about positive change. And you're asking me to speak more on the political economy, which is the googly that makes things that much harder to translate these wonderful visions into actual reality. Well, why does that happen? Let's just think through some of the challenges. First of all, cities themselves were not on the agenda for the longest time. And it's only the JNNURM that, under UPA 1, that's the first time, the political, environment really placed cities at the forefront and said, we're going to pump in resources, because that was a belated recognition of the kind of growth that cities were demonstrating, the kind of growth engines they had become for the economy, and JNNURM certainly put in a lot of effort on the infrastructure and governance side of cities and their management. Why were cities neglected? Why are they still neglected to some extent? Partly because they have fewer assembly and parliament seats compared to rural areas, and therefore there's a little bit of an imbalance there. Further, many of the other challenges that you see in cities, for example, which became very stark during the first lockdown, the discovery of India's discovery of the urban migrants. These were the invisible workforce that worked in our homes, in our factories, as street vendors, whatever else. And the fact is, nobody had paid attention until we saw them making the long march home. So that's another set of people who, because they don't vote in the cities, because they don't otherwise, they just come here to work temporarily or even in a longer term manner, they're not their concerns and needs are not addressed either, right? So basically, the political economy, when you start thinking along those dimensions, one dimension is about incentives. Okay, who responds to what? The other, of course, is everyone is to some extent a prisoner of processes. Okay, and so what do we mean by that? That includes constitutional arrangements. For example, until the 73rd and 74th Amendments, we did not have as much emphasis on what we now call the third tier of governance, right? Essentially, but even when you take a look at the 74th Amendment, does it fulfill its vision, its promise? No, it doesn't, because in many cases, a lot of, as they say, funds, functions, and functionaries have not been delegated in sufficient strength to empower local bodies and to give them an opportunity to actually make a difference beyond beyond certain narrow domains. Why does that happen? At least in Bangalore, in Karnataka, you have what are called parastatals. So when it comes to water, you have an entity that may be focused on Bangalore, but it may still be run by the state. You have something similar with electricity, something similar with roads, and when it comes to lakes and water nature, again you see a fragmentation of who gets to manage them and who doesn't. So all these factors, that's one level of structure. And this is something that if the senior bureaucrat had been here today, she would have been able to elaborate on how they navigate those complexities. But then the other dimension has to do with processes regarding urban planning, for example, right? So for example, in Bangalore, we get to see the master plans most often after it has already been substantially drafted. There are not enough consultations ahead of time. And when it is drafted, many of the visions and the planning processes seem to focus on, okay, if you have an undulating landscape, how do we flatten it? How do we create sprawl and create more, 20 by 30 sites for people to build their independent homes? The whole approach of 15-minute cities, of reimagining, density and, different ways of relating density to public infrastructure and transport and services and things like that. A lot of that is not even embedded in the planning process. And, and the political leadership comes and goes. So we may initiate something, but somebody else who's been there and who continues to be there ends up crafting a whole story with regard to how the system is going to develop. Now, some of these are in people's control. Some of these other features and factors are not that readily in our control. Some of them have to do with misaligned incentives. Aaditya Thackeray talked, beautifully about how waste segregation is getting implemented very rapidly in Mumbai. In Bengaluru, we often pay for waste on the basis of the amount of weight that has been transported. So even if we mandate a household level segregation, the waste contractor, who is paid on the basis of how much weight he transports, ends up actually mixing it all up once again. So, that is an example of a perverse arrangement that, that we just need to spend more time understanding. One of the great, lessons of what we've discussed so far is the extraordinary amount of engagement with cities and solutions that we've seen from Pooja Tiwari and the Bloomberg Foundation, from Jamshyd Godrej and industry and CII over time, and the think tanks, not just Shakti, but also Ashish Rao Ghorpade's organization, which is working to bring in, knowledge. So part of the problem is about knowledge, about understanding where things go wrong and trying to figure out how to fix it. But we also need to change the incentives for the political leadership. If the political leadership's rewards and recognition come from visible mega projects, right? Okay, so it could be, let's build a steel flyover. Let's build, something else, concrete and steel, which demonstrates that you've done something. right? If you clean the air, it's pretty hard to make a claim that you were the person who was significantly responsible for that, right? So in that sense, and these mega projects have certain other political economic advantages for political actors. There's some amount of leakage that might happen from these budgets. Okay, so basically, these are all challenges that we face as we think about how do we fix the system. However, if you can generate awareness, if civil society can also create momentum for the political actors to demonstrate their track record according to certain, sort of visible, measurable goals, right? So, for example, if you say that, how many lakes have you preserved and purified and beautified, or whatever the case may be, right? If those become the criteria, then of course you will see a quick response from political actors as well, from political leadership as well. And we have seen that when it comes to those sorts of issues, we are, facing, we are at the border of legal and illegal, right? There is so much money in urban real estate, for example, that lakes in Bangalore, for example, tend to get encroached. And it's a heroic effort by civil society and by government, for that matter, to try and remedy this. Okay, and over time, you find that even in the planning process, the old approach used to be that, oh, you see a lake, let's convert that into a bus stand, into a stadium, into a layout. Okay, and so every once in a while, when it rains, a city like Bangalore, 3,000 feet above sea level, drained by 4 major valleys, you'll suddenly see that people are dying because they're drowning in some flood. Okay, how did this happen? Well, this is happening in an area, they'll say something called ST bed. What's the T bed part of it? Tank bed. There was a lake there and you built on it. And where does the water gravitate when it rains? It goes right there. Okay, so these sorts of things. And people have encroached upon the pathways through which water flows from one tank to another. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And many of the encroachers tend to be, these tend to be the first steps in a flourishing political career. So these are, real challenges when it comes to balancing things out. However, when we think about the larger goal of net zero, right, there are many ways in which you can work together, and because there are still so many win-wins. When you, in the old days, we used to fly over Bangalore city, or in most towns actually, you still get to fly over a portion of the urban area, and you get to see solar, rooftop solar, right? And, what initially started as just a heating element. Now the technology is evolving, there is smart grids emerging, and you can actually end up in a situation where apartment buildings, individual homes can all find it lucrative to actually avoid connecting to the grid, and for that matter, taking care of themselves. We need to encourage people and educate them more about rainwater harvesting, for example, because that again, can be a great solution, and and put less demand on natural resources. And as we think through some of these challenges, let's also think about how some good examples. It's not just about cities; it's about cities and their hinterland, right? And so in Bangalore for many years, we've been advocating for suburban rail. And the idea is, let's use the existing railway infrastructure like Mumbai does for, with more frequent trains to our surrounding areas, because that's where people come into the city from. And if they don't have to come by road, then you are going to be able to make that much of or you're going to make a substantial difference to them and their lives. You can also make a huge difference if you if these suburban rails actually can also have better services for the neighborhood. I once, when I was a professor at IIM, organized a workshop for ministers and MLAs from the surrounding districts, Because I said suburban rail is not just for us in the city, it's for you. Because this way, the doctor from Bangalore who refuses to be transferred, the teacher who refuses to be transferred, would happily commute to your place and come back at night and stay at home. If they were already in Bangalore, right? So these sorts of situations. But the more interesting story is one which is fascinating. It's called the Casey Valley Project. Okay, this was a project that was brought up, advocated by people from my native district of Kolar. You would have heard of gold mines and things like that. Well, Kolar is a neighboring district to Bangalore. And over the years, there's been groundwater depletion. There's a lot of, it's sort of the horticultural breadbasket for Bangalore city. But water, it's a rain shadow area. And so what we've all managed to get the government to do, Bengaluru gets its water from the Kaveri River. It's about 50 kilometers south, and 500 meters, the water is pumped up and then distributed around the city. Once it's used, it just flows out as wastewater. It gets contaminated. There's a huge lake called Berandur that occasionally catches fire. So you get a sense of how challenging the whole problem is. What we, many others as well, were able to do, where Kolar district origin leaders were able to do, was to argue to the government that we should treat this Berandur water, lift it upstream, and then let gravity flow take care of getting that water into the chain tank system of Kolar district. Okay, and this process has started, and so we're now seeing a balance, not just it's not just sort of an urban-centric approach. It's an urban and rural integration approach, right? And and basically, it's like literally creating a new perennial river in an area which had never seen one. Okay, so because there's going to be water moving every day, and the chain tank system basically means that water flows through a series of historic irrigation tanks, which are linked to one another by canals. And as one overflows, the other one gets filled up, the groundwater recharges, and in a few years' time, we should have a very, very green neighborhood. Anyway, I'm just pointing out that these are imaginative solutions which the political leadership was able to come up with, because we can also take credit for it. Okay, we want to do good, and we want to be seen to be doing good, and we want to be rewarded for doing good, right? Essentially. So that's so how do we come up with these kinds of incentives? How do you work with urban growth to ensure that the design elements change, that we become walkable, cyclable, livable cities, and and the whole approach becomes one where the impact of our growing cities just becomes much, much more low and manageable, trending towards net zero. I'll stop.
Thank you very much, sir. Very insightful. As a Bangalorean, I relate to a lot of what you have said just now and completely understand some of the conundrums there. But also appreciate the aspect you brought in of the misaligned incentives. And really, that's the challenge for policymakers and policy making itself. How do we change those incentives, align them to achieve the positive externalities in this case that we are looking for? So thank you so much. And the examples were great. The win-win of rooftop, essentially, really, I mean, that's we don't need to argue that anymore. It's pretty clear and evident. So thanks so much. We will go into the question and answer session next. So let me just quickly take a look at what questions we have got, and I'll try and either we can pick up the questions as you'd like, or I'll just pose it first. So I think, Ashish, you have a question directed towards you, so I'll just put that to you directly. So the question here is, how do we have inclusiveness of people in such projects that you kind of presented made in your presentation itself?
So thank you. Yes. I think in terms of how the approach that we follow at the city level on developing the climate action plans is in itself inclusive. I mentioned the steps wherein after we've got the city to the engineering team and the leadership at the city level to agree broadly to what we are suggesting, we then present it to other stakeholders as well as some of the citizen groups in terms of how they see this and whether we could include it within the plan. Once the plan is finalized and passed through the council, it is put up on the municipal website and people can share their comments and suggestions. An additional layer of ensuring that people get to participate is as the specific projects get implemented, they follow through the process that has been recommended for implementation of projects, which means that the residents who would be affected, the beneficiaries, they get to have a say on how they would like to see the project going further. That means oftentimes projects are redirected, readjusted, and sometimes absolutely decided to be implemented for a later time because of the kind of responses we get from the citizens. But it's a usual process to make sure that citizens and community is involved in on the specific project level to give inputs. And at the plan level, I already explained how this goes. Thank you.
If any of the other panelists would like to chime in, certainly we could. If not, we could go to the next question. So I have a question for you, Ms. Tiwari. So you've, in your presentation, you did talk about a lot of your the work that is being supported by Bloomberg. Would you like to mention one or two challenges that you think need to be overcome to accelerate climate action? I think that's the challenge we're facing right now, especially in cities in this context, right?
Thank you, Vivek. And maybe just to answer your question and give a context, maybe I'll speak about a particular very recent report. So over the past year, Bloomberg Associates partnered with the Global Covenant of Mayors and the World Resources Institute to better understand what cities need to accelerate the pace and scale of climate action to achieve their emission goals. And collectively, leaders from 58 cities were interviewed, additional 300 cities surveyed, 500 tools reviewed. And actually, it was found that 60% of the cities reported developing some sort of climate action plans or starting efforts to reduce emissions, showing that local leaders are committed. But only 22% of cities reported implementing climate projects at scale. And that shows that changes are needed for cities to really translate these ambitions into deep emission reductions. And speaking of what really are the challenges, so apart from finance, which is in any case one that I would really like to speak about is the lack of outcome data to make the case to demonstrate how climate action delivers on other policy outcomes. And Dr. Gowda also sort of related to that. Example, improved air quality, reduced congestion, job creation. So stressing the associated equity, health, economic benefits of climate action. And even when city leadership is broadly committed to climate action, climate can be seen as an issue competing with other institutional priorities like public health, poverty, equity, economic development. However, in practice, impactful climate policy can double as good public policy across issues. For example, research from C40 found that public transit investment can create over 4 million additional jobs across 97 cities, the C40 network cities, and their supply chains. And in the next decade, while reducing air pollution from transport by up to 45%, in cities with low private vehicle use. So climate really needs to be framed as a complementary, not competitive issue. And staff need the data to do this. And there are some cities such as Bridgewater, Oakland, Philadelphia, which provide some examples to look at where they are actively centering their work around people-oriented metrics, such as job creation, access to community services, housing affordability. And then they're tracking these this outcome data to show progress. So I think that was, of course, there are some more, and maybe one quick challenge that I would like to add is also project management capacity. So sustainability teams often have access to the technical expertise needed to shape the details of a potential project. But cities lack staff to effectively manage projects from the idea to the execution. And that's where I think, as mentioned, this whole collaboration, coordinated effort from different agencies can really come into play. Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. Actually, there was another question around what you've answered just now. So I'm just going to pose it in case there are other panelists would like to talk about it. So there's a question on net zero pathways and SDGs. Sometimes these can be divergent. They don't need to really coincide. Would any of the panelists like to take this?
Well, by definition, I suppose, net zero means you balance, input versus output, and the overall equation works out to zero. But when you're talking about sustainability, you're talking about actually reduction. You're talking about transformation of the kinds of inputs and technologies and energy that you use. And so SDGs are much more ambitious in that sense. You can, reach net zero in a more, maybe more quickly than bring about a sustainable transformation. But that's just the professor responding, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. Just looking for another question. Yeah, there's a question, maybe Dr. Godrej, we could probably stick to you on this one. So here's a question on how do you prevent elite capture of policy making?
Yeah, so I mean, this is so who are these elites, right? Are these elites crony capitalist, land grabbing sharks or something like that, or are they civic-minded do-gooders, right? So that's part of the challenge. So, for example, in Bengaluru over the years, we've seen some, really eminent citizens coming together. We've the Bangalore Agenda Task Force, Nandan Nilekani and others led that, and then they brought about transformation in the way the municipal corporation handled its finances, came out with visions for how the city should develop, paid attention to the need for public toilets, accessible all over the place. I mean, it was a balance of many things. The real challenge there was, who are these unelected people to influence outcomes? That was the real question. But the point is that they were, that's a section of people who had already made spectacular amounts of money in the IT industry and other sectors, and they were really coming to, they had a more philanthropic mindset, right? Now, we can't say that this is what's going to happen everywhere. So you also need to have oversight. You also need to have processes that allow for a much more inclusive set of consultations and discussions and open meetings and things like that. Because when you do that, if there's some amount of transparency on what the plan is, right? See, because the other challenge with elites is that elites also may be more prone to, focusing on improving roads rather than public transport, which they may not take, right? So all these sorts of trade-offs are involved. But if you put everyone together in the same hall and you ask people in a neighborhood to say, okay, let's listen to every voice here, then you will see that if you explain that we're planning to, take over so much land, cut so many trees, bulldoze so many huts, because we want to, provide this, it won't go down that well unless you can convince them that some other trade-off is going to happen in their benefit, right? That hasn't been the case. The way cities have grown, for example, has always been, historically, there's, some farmland is annexed. People are given, until the recent land compensation laws, a pittance, and suddenly you have a whole new neighborhood that's emerged, and and the farmer is now the gardener in the bungalow that's come up in his old land, right? I mean, that's what, and the cows are floating around eating at garbage dumps. These are the sorts of realities that we live with. And there's one other angle here, which is a lot of this, by the way, happens even without a formal process of land acquisition, because there are real estate entrepreneurs who buy land cheap, develop it, and they're responsible for some of the mushrooming, unplanned layouts and things like that. Okay, what we call revenue layouts, which then pose a huge problem for the larger planning process. So, which elites? What are they up to? How do you balance their power, where and their knowledge, asymmetry of knowledge with other people and their concerns? That's really the challenge. But I wouldn't rule out elites. Many of them have tremendous knowledge and worthwhile inputs, and many of the participants today would qualify under that criteria as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for those insights. Actually, I think both Ashish and Pooja as well in their comments did highlight the need for inclusive, community-based, discussion-based approach to solving these problems. So I think we are all on the same page on this issue, at least. So thanks so much to the panelists. We're coming to the end of our allotted time. In fact, I'm probably 2 minutes over. So I would like to first start by thanking the panelists. Thank you for all the valuable thoughts that you've posed here, brought your experience to bear while doing so. And I think we're all a little bit wiser at the end of today for having heard you. And I think with that, I would probably hand back to Anshu to close the webinar for today.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivek. This was really an excellent discussion and thoroughly enjoyable. I'd like to thank all our panelists, Minister Aaditya Thackeray, Professor Rajiv Gowda, Pooja, Ashish, for making their time available and joining on Friday evening, especially on a Friday evening. I also thank all our fellow participants who have joined and stayed with us. As far as Shakti goes, this is a very important area of our work. We, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, we realize the importance of cities in climate action. Mr. Godrej also talked about the need for cities as focus areas. We are developing our strategies and plans of how to go about it, and we need good inputs. So we would request all partners to reach out and give us advice on how best philanthropic money can be spent in cities for climate action. Because the one thing which has emerged in today's discussion is that while cities provide great opportunities, there are also various challenges that we need to work around, which revolve around governance, the political issues, leadership, and also technical aspects. So given this landscape, what are the opportunities where we can make the most impact in the use of philanthropic capital is something that we are trying to understand. But having said that, we definitely have made up our minds to engage with cities. For example, proactive cities which are willing to take leadership in climate action. We are really happy to work with them. Given that climate action also has co-benefits in areas like air pollution and other civic amenities, so we would be happy to work together. So we look forward to engaging with ideas and with all partners, both from civil service community, the civil society community, the political class, the administrative class, philanthropic donors. At the end of the day, we need philanthropic money to have more impact. So we look forward to all these partnerships. With that, I thank all of you once more for your time, excellent discussions and suggestions to Shakti. Thank you very much to all of you, and have a good night and have a good weekend. Bye.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
A wonderful evening. Thank you so much.